Hey guys, Dr. Arland Hill. Does carbohydrate source matter? What I'm really asking here is, does it matter where you get your carbohydrates from? It's pretty common to hear from time to time here in the office that if I get my carbohydrates from grains, or if I get my carbohydrates from fruit, or if I get my carbohydrates from, say, a starchy vegetable, it doesn't really matter as long as I get an equivalent amount of carbohydrates. That's not technically accurate, and what I want to share with you today is the reason why. So we're going to go through a couple of things here, and I've picked two examples. On the right side of the board here, you're going to see pasta. Pasta, we know, can be made from several things, but for the example today, I'm going to utilize wheat as the source of where it's coming from. And then on the other side over here, I've got butternut squash. And let's just for simplicity's sake, make the argument that this is 40 grams of pasta versus 40 grams of starchy vegetable, and in this case, butternut squash. Now, what I want to point out are a couple of the differences here, and why it's not just about the amount of carbohydrates that you're consuming. The first thing you'll see up here are nutrients. Butternut squash is going to have a much broader nutrient profile to it, which means you're going to get a broader array of vitamins and minerals that are going to be more consistent with supporting your overall health. Pasta or wheat can't make that argument. You're going to be pretty limited in what you're going to be getting from it. Yes, you will get some B vitamins, a few minerals, but you also get a couple of what are known as anti-nutrients in there as well that are not going to be found in butternut squash in this example. The second thing you're going to see is fiber listed up here. Now, to be fair, if we make an argument for whole grain pasta or wheat in its lesser refined forms, does it have fiber? Yes, it does have fiber. However, the amount of fiber that it has per the amount of total carbohydrate is not that much. It's actually fairly insignificant. If we look at the fiber source for butternut squash, it actually makes up a pretty large contribution. If you've ever eaten butternut squash, say for example, maybe you bake a butternut squash, when you cut it in half and look at it and start to pull it apart with a fork, you can actually see the fibery components of that. It's very dense in fiber, and there's a lot of benefits to that, some of which are just it supports good gastrointestinal health. The next item I've got up here is potassium. Potassium is something that we routinely need to find in our diet. It's something that helps keep our body alkaline, and it's not something that we're going to find in the grain categories, and again, pasta in this example. But potassium, because of its alkalizing nature, it's one of the things that helps promote optimal neurological function. We tend to lose potassium easily, so we have to continually consume foods that are going to replete potassium. Even from the standpoint of maybe something like blood pressure, potassium is extremely crucial in helping maintain the volume of blood or the volume of water in our blood. The next item here, non-GMO. Butternut squash is not genetically modified. Now, whether you're a GMO fan or on the fence about it, the bottom line with genetically modified organisms right now is that we just don't know. There's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts about it that we just aren't sure about. And quite frankly, a lot of these foods that are genetically modified, apart from the genetic modification issue and how that can interact with our own genome and how we're consuming foods that may not be ideal for us to consume because we haven't consumed them throughout our history, the other issue that comes into this and that actually links us into the next point here is toxicity risk. So when you look at genetically modified foods, a lot of the reasons that these foods are modified has to do with the very fact that they can have toxins applied to them. You don't see that with butternut squash or with other starchy vegetables, so you don't run those inherent risk of potentially consuming a food that doesn't match up to your own genetics, and also consuming a food that has a very high toxicity risk associated with that. Those risks do increase with your grains or with pasta, something of that nature. Allergen risk. Again, you may or may not be in the camp of gluten's a problem, gluten's not a problem. Basically, what I'm going to leave you with on this is, if you read the medical literature, medical literature is pretty emphatic that gluten's a problem. And it's not just someone who has celiac disease. We're also talking about individuals who have what's known as gluten sensitivity. Now, Again, you're looking at the consistent consumption of a protein as part of the standard American diet. It's in here, it's routinely consumed, and the more repetitively we consume a food, the more problematic that food becomes. Butternut squash doesn't run that risk because it doesn't have that big allergenic protein in it. So it does not have the same allergen risk associated with it. There's also some issues that come into play with the irritation and inflammation that comes along with consuming pasta and wheat and gluten. That's going to create an inflammatory response, and you just don't get that inflammatory response and that accompanying allergen risk from butternut squash or other starchy vegetables. That leads us into the next point, which is these foods, the starchy vegetables, are going to be very rich in color. Just think about this as an example. When you take a box of pasta, and let's say you had some pasta in this hand, and let's say you had a butternut squash in this hand. Pasta is very dull. It's either going to be white or brown, whereas a butternut squash is going to be very rich and vibrant in color. It's going to be very orange, deep orange color. Think about a sweet potato having that deep orange color, or maybe beets, another starchy vegetable, having a very deep red color. That red color that we think about, those are polyphenols, what we call polyphenols. But we also think about those as antioxidants. At the end of the day, what these do is squelch inflammation. They keep inflammation under control. And another added benefit that we get from these is that the bacteria in our gut, which we all like to talk about now, these probiotics, they like polyphenols. They like antioxidants. They love that color. That color supports their growth. If we're trying to modify the bacterial environment in our gut, consuming foods that are rich in color is very favorable to those organisms. And you'll see in here I put supports probiotics. The reason I put supports probiotics is because if we're looking to try to, and in very simplistic terms here, it's much more complicated than this, but in very simplistic terms, if we're trying to promote the growth of the beneficial organisms and inhibit the growth of some of the non-beneficial organisms, that really comes back down to the color component. You completely miss that benefit from consuming pastas and wheats and grains and this whole category of carbohydrates. Same thing can be said going back to the fiber component, because fiber additionally is going to enhance the growth of those bacteria as well. It's going to give them their nice little nest in your gastrointestinal tract that helps them flourish and do all the beneficial things that they can do for us. So let me ask you, do carbohydrates matter? I think we can make an argument yes, but let me give one final closing point on this. Plant estrogens. Now, when we think about plant estrogens, a lot of times plant estrogens are thought about as it relates to soy, for example. I'm not advocating soy here by any means, but what I am suggesting is that whether it's butternut squash or whether it's, say for example, again I'll use the beets or the turnips, the rutabagas, the okra, all these different types of foods with all this color in them also have a wide variety of plant estrogens in them. The beneficial thing about this is that these are estrogen-like compounds that are not overly stimulatory. They stimulate just enough to get the positive benefits from estrogen, but they don't overstimulate, say for example, like if someone was actually taking a estrogen hormone replacement therapy. And with the plant category, we just don't see those same benefits in any significant contribution. So, does the carbohydrate source really matter? I think we can easily answer the question and say, yes, it absolutely matters where you get your carbohydrates from. It's not about 40 grams of carbohydrates versus 40 grams of carbohydrates. It's much different than that. We have to stop thinking in such a narrow viewpoint of our food and look at what food has to offer beyond just simply calories. It's not calories in and calories out. This is why two people who can consume 40 grams of pasta versus 40 grams of butternut squash, the end result is going to be much different. This is going to be a much healthier individual who makes this a mainstay of their diet. So I appreciate you listening today. I'm Dr. Arland Hill.